because this has been my primary area of study, not only with the problem of evil, but cosmology. That's been my area of expertise as a graduate student. And I thought that I would talk about some of the questions that have been raised, some of them legitimate, some of them really wacky. But it's an opportunity to kind of have these questions rain down upon us so that we can interact with them and just kind of explain why some of the questions don't really work or pan out in terms of being viable objections in a roundabout way against the existence of God through the cosmological argument. So I want to talk about two levels of what this cosmological argument is, other than a difficult term you don't want to say 5 times fast. So Joe, you can go to the next slide here. This is the person on the street, and I remember being in high school, a new Christian myself, in my physics class, and someone had asked me, why do I think that God exists? And the closest thing to a sculpted cosmological argument came out something like this. The universe sure is vast and orderly. Okay, it had to come from somewhere, and it couldn't have just happened. Therefore, I think that God exists. And maybe this has been your frame of reference when you talk to other people, or when you're in churches, or when you hear a pastor speak. Someone who's not sculpted philosophically or even theologically, these are the sorts of premises that might mount an argument for God's existence. And they don't really move too many people, except unless you're already a Christian or a believer in God, then you're liable to see these kinds of reasons to be something somewhat convincing. But go to the next slide here. Here's a very well-sculpted version that has been reborn since the 1970s. And this was the subject of my master's thesis, in which I defended before. This was in the early 90s that I started going to work on this. And as cosmology, the study of the universe and its origins, has been a rapidly increasing and developing kind of an industry as it relies upon astrophysics, which is not just some sort of static science out there. It's constantly changing. Okay, there are new discoveries all the time, people reeling for various different explanations, and new matter and new scenarios always are coming to the table. And I noticed that nobody was really keeping up with that at the time. Even in academia, very few people were kind of writing a lot on this particular subject. So I took it upon myself to cast my lots in the direction to try to see if I couldn't come up with good reasons to deflect some of the major objections that were being raised that really weren't being handled. Now, in 2011, it's passed me up big time, and so I've let it ride. There have been a lot of great minds concentrating on the cosmological argument for God's existence, and so since they're already battling this out in the professional journals, and to me this argument has been really staying the course, then I sort of pulled back and have changed direction in my own doctoral work. But just to rehash a sort of formal presentation on what a good, clean cosmological argument looks like, here's one that's withstood the test of time. Premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, that's just been something that people don't typically doubt. Things that begin to exist have a cause. Yeah, I mean, if I'm up here talking and suddenly a gorilla appears in the middle of the stage and dribbling a basketball, running up and down, we don't just sit here and stay to ourselves and not worry about it and keep looking at the PowerPoint. We immediately want to know, where did this thing come from? Is it, is UNLV scoping for some local talent? I mean, what's happening here? Okay, where did this thing come from? So that's just something that resonates as almost a metaphysical truism, but I'll comment more on this in just a moment. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Here's where this argument's received a lot of traction, is that ever since Edwin Hubble's discovery in 1929, pointing a telescope and doing a spectral analysis of galaxies, you see the galaxies are receding away equally in all directions, and they exhibit what's called redshift. Well, as a result of these observations, it's now confirmed that the universe has been expanding away from a central point. That means, of course, that if you rewind the tape, they at some point had converged at a single point. And you can only go back so far, namely somewhere between 15 to 20 billion years at the time, that's what it was said, and you arrive that the universe was at some point a singular point. That was confirmed in the 1960s by Penzias and Wilson, who discovered that the universe contained microwave background radiation, which is sort of like residual heat signature. Just to give you an example, if you saw a cup of coffee sitting up here and you dip your finger in it and it was still warm, or really regardless of what temperature it was, but if it's still sort of in the warm cycle, you could assess at some point how long it's been there, okay, and that it hadn't always been there, kind of a thing. So we had two scientific confirmations that the universe began to exist. Philosophers of antiquity, especially in the Middle Ages, especially Islamic philosophers, believed that the universe was always finite. It was not eternal. But at the time, atheists were very comfortable in saying that the universe is eternal and that's it. It hasn't been any other way. Bertrand Russell used to say that. And believe it or not, Thomas Aquinas, who himself phrased one of the most popular versions of the cosmological argument itself, actually assumes the universe was eternal. So that seemed to be a pretty powerful thing to hold at that time period, all the way through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment period. But as of the early 20th century, that thesis is no longer sustained. The universe definitely began to exist. In fact, Alan Guth, in an interview in 2007, basically said, and he sort of speaks the same sentiment amongst all his scientific colleagues, that those who don't think that the universe began now with the Big Bang is a crackpot. Now, that's his professional opinion. But he echoes the sentiment of science. It is indisputable the universe began to exist, at least this universe, about 13.47 billion years ago. We could actually measure it within that element of precision, okay? Thanks to the what's called the W map, where recently we had sort of a spectrographic image of some of the universe within the first 300,000 years of its life. And from that, we could infer that the universe is exactly that old. So we know now when the universe was born, and it hadn't always been around. So premise 2 has struck to be pretty good, to the chagrin of some people. So you've had historically Stephen Hawking in his 1988 huge bestseller, A Brief History of Time, says that the Big Bang smacks of divine intervention, though he finds a workaround to it. P.C.W. Davies, who comes out and says that he says, through my scientific work, I have come to believe more and more strongly that the physical universe is put together with an ingenuity so astonishing that I cannot accept it as a brute fact. The Big Bang involves a certain metaphysical aspect which may be either appealing or revolting, according to a variety of different scientists in the Astrophysical Journal article in the 1970s. And I can go on, reading a host of different quotes and citations of people who find not only the reality of the universe began to exist, but that the implications are profound. See, now you have to ask yourself no longer, did it begin to exist, but where did it come from? And that, of course, has put scientists to work even as of recent. So that leads tentatively to this conclusion, well, deductively it leads to this conclusion, like it or not, that the universe itself has a cause. Okay? So that right there deserves a little bit of pause. But we move on from there because it doesn't stop, because at some point you got to get from that conclusion to God's existence. Premise 4. So universe has a cause. If that serves as the third premise, premise 4 is the cause must be either personal, impersonal, or somehow an abstract object of some sort. Well, abstract objects don't have any causal force on anything. The number 1 doesn't make you run a red light or something like that. Okay, there's no causal activity with abstract objects. Propositions don't have any causal power on you. They don't force your hand. They don't make you do things. So that leaves personal or impersonal. Unlikely it's an impersonal cause, because basically an impersonal cause would be a series of events, or an event itself that was eternal in some way. However, if you have an eternal event that obeys, presumably, physical laws of some sort, then whatever effect it produces itself will also be infinite and eternal. But since that betrays our observation, then the universe cannot itself be made by something impersonal. So process of elimination, personal, is a pretty good candidate. And if that exhausts all of our options in terms of causal activity, then an agent causation seems to survive that. Because a person, a mind, can suddenly do something different. Impersonal things can't do that. When the laws are laid down, I mean, if you have a pot of water sitting on a flame, if that flame's been on for eternity, and any water that's been around for eternity exists, that water will constantly be cooked from eternity. So there will be no difference. There will be no change. Premise 5, the cause then is neither impersonal nor abstract, and that leads us deductively to that the cause is personal. Then the final step is through just reflection. If you're sort of a scientist or Sherlock Holmesian kind of a person and you're analyzing that you have a personal cause of the universe, already that makes atheism a little uncomfortable as a position. But still, how do you go from a personal cause to God? And there are some suggestions on how one might do this, okay, that are rational and not leaps of logic. One would be, of course, that given the vastness of our universe, this kind of gets back to this idea of the common presentation of, the universe is so vast and glorious and that kind of a thing. The fact of the matter is this universe is replete with so many physical laws and constants and quantities, and to be able to yield something as vast as the universe that we have, billions, trillions of stars, billions of galaxies, and who knows what else, seems like this cause must be extremely powerful and intelligent to be able to yield something of this magnitude. It just sounds very good in terms of a probable inference. If our universe was caused by something personal that should be intelligent, if not all-knowing, that should be extremely powerful, if not all-powerful, it seems like we're already inferentially aiming toward the attributes of God. And that, in my estimation, has been a pretty impressive piece of reasoning, like I said, that has withstood the test of time. But because it has, in fact, been at the forefront of arguments for God's existence, not surprisingly, a lot of questions and objections are raised. Now, I can't hope to address every single objection ever raised against this kind of an argument. So I just want to sort of, given that we have the top 5 issues, well, if just dealing with cosmology here, maybe we can break these down to sort of the top few questions about this one issue. So here's a question about the first premise then. Remember, that first premise says whatever begins to exist has a cause. There is an exception, some say, in quantum indeterminacy, or in the form of the question here. And I got to remember Alex Trebek here. Would you put that in the form of a question? Is there an exception with quantum indeterminacy in the quantum vacuum state, since it has been defined as a nothing whereby particles are brought into existence? This will require some unpacking because quantum physics is a strange world in and of itself. But there's a lot of speculation. Now that observation confirms that our universe was likely created in some kind of a vacuum, then it's possible that this vacuum state exists on a quantum level. This is where things get really bizarre. Prior to 10 to the minus 43 second after the creation point of the Big Bang, that's when the physical laws as we know it sort of took over. But before then, it was basically ollie oxen free to some degree. At least that's the perception. Anything goes. That's what the phrase quantum indeterminacy comes from. A man named Heisenberg had convincingly argued that under certain conditions, some things cannot be projected to be at a, if I take a baseball and throw it, depending upon the velocity and the trajectory and the strength of gravity, knowing the physical laws as we do, we could predict exactly where that ball would end up, granted that we know everything about, that trajectory. Well, quantum indeterminacy is literally that which says you can't basically know. You can't predict where something is going to be. And even worse than that, there are some things, like electrons, that could actually be in two places at once. So it's a very bizarre world. I can't go into detail without losing everyone, so just trust me on that. Quantum physics is a very strange world. That's why science fiction uses that phrase a lot, quantum mechanics, quantum physics, because it becomes the catch-all for, if I can't explain something, I'm just going to throw it in the realm of quantum physics and make it sound complicated. But it's a world that has at least 8 different metaphysical interpretations, at least 8. So this quantum vacuum from which our universe comes from is discerned by prominent scientists like recently Lawrence Krauss, Hawking himself, Victor Stenger, a host of others, who recognize that the quantum state is a state of nothing, but we put that in quotes. This nothing suddenly produces particles that are basically used in the subatomic level to generate light particles, photons. And as a result of that, we have basically new matter. So if that's where the story ends, okay, that you have this quantum vacuum, this what's called this chaotic random fluxing and bubbling that's taking place, from that, charges will pop into existence. Because you have, say, electrons have a negative charge. You'll have other things pop into existence that will interact with those electrons. And then this is the level at which physical matter will ultimately be generated. So scientifically, it looks impressive on paper to say, hey, something is coming from nothing. And it happens on the scientific level. So much for thinking that the universe can't pop into existence without a cause. It happens all the time in the quantum world. Now that's an unfortunate kind of thing, but a lot of people have played on this. They've tried to say that, and it's trickling down to a lot of popular people who want to say, look, you have an instance in science now where something pops into existence uncaused out of nothing. But that's not the reality of the quantum vacuum. The reason why the quantum vacuum is defined as nothing is because you have matter and antimatter, which, if you do a net check on these things, you have positive things with positive charge, things with negative charge, and put them together, the net charge is 0. So they call it 0-point energy. Think of it this way: you're a student, or you probably have a certain amount of debt. Let's put it that way. You have a certain amount of debt, but at the same time, you probably have a job and make a little bit of money. So you have cash that's leaving your pocket, okay, like what Red Skelton used to say. They say money talks, all money ever says is goodbye. So you've got money leaving your wallet, but at the same time, money's coming into your wallet. Now, the net value of that is basically 0, as long as it's an even keel. As long as the money that's exiting your pocketbook is at the same rate the money is being put into it. So the net value of that financial flow will be 0. That's kind of roughly what they mean by 0-point energy in the quantum vacuum. But that doesn't mean there's nothing there. What that means is giving one type of electric charge or one type of matter and then antimatter to it, okay, it cancels itself out. But every physicist knows that the quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's not some void of non-existence. It's a something. In fact, it's a richly endowed field of fluctuating, or as it says here, chaotic, random, fluxing and bubbling energy that occasionally spews forth something that passes over and pops into existence. Well, when they say pop into existence, again, they don't mean out of nothing. Popping into existence means it takes on material form. It goes from an energy state into a particle state, thereby becomes observable. Go to the next slide. The void is a quantum sea of 0-point waves with all possible wavelengths. 0-point motion of electromagnetic fields is ever present in the vacuum, and the vacuum is far from empty. The vacuum is filled with virtual particles. The quantum vacuum is like a configuration with the lowest possible energy. That's a recent publication by scientist Frank Close. So the point is to call that nothing is extremely misleading. And you're liable to be dazzled by the scientific speak that's behind it. But that is not an exception to the rule. No metaphysician, I dare say, would come out and think that it's likely or usual or prominent that things can come out of existence from nothing. It's a mainstay amongst metaphysicians that non-being does nothing because it's not an entity. From nothing, nothing derives is another way that that's expressed. And that seems to stick. The quantum vacuum is not the exception to the rule, despite what some people might say. Okay, good, move on here. Questions about premise 2, then, that the universe began to exist. Again, nobody really doubts that. What it turns into is, well, are we just talking about this universe? Because we probably grew up with Star Trek or some of these science fiction shows which traffic in multiple worlds. Well, now it's not just conversation amongst science fiction advocates. Multiple worlds and things of that sort are far from just exotic portraits of your favorite TV show. They're the part of real-time dialogue amongst scientists themselves. So this question, is the universe part of some sort of eternal super universe? It's an old question, but it lays the foundation for this idea that we may not be alone, or our universe might not be alone. Okay? We're not created in some kind of a vacuum. We're not the only universe out there with a bunch of galaxies in it, but we're actually but a bubble within a larger context of space-time, even if that space-time doesn't operate or behave the same as ours. It may blow our minds to think about that. Our universe, as vast as it is, could itself be a blip in a sandy beach full of other universes as numerous as the sands on the beach. So if we ask the question, is the universe part of an eternal super universe, the short answer to this is we don't know, which probably isn't what you would like to hear, but the reality is we actually don't know. Like I said, there's some confirming evidence that our singularity, the point at which our universe came into existence, seems to have certain attributes that tell us maybe, and this is called inflation, but maybe that occurred in a sort of vacuum state in another universe. If that's true, that doesn't mean anything. All it means is that our universe has an environment elsewhere. So from that, we should not automatically extrapolate that, then if our universe is not the only one, and we're part of a mother universe, a mothership as it were, then that mothership could be eternal. So gotcha, didn't we? No. Because in a recent study in 2003 by Alexander Vilenkin, Alan Guth, and Arvind Borde, some MIT physicists and so forth, people collaboration, did an exhaustive study on what a universe would look like if it were expanding into the future. Any universe, no matter what the mechanics of it were. So whether it's our universe or a theoretical super universe, if it is expanding, it has a point of origin. So every expanding universe would have a point of origin. And it seems to, and of course, most of the models, not every single one of them, almost all of the models show our universe in a super universe that itself is expanding. So you put 2 and 2 together. If our super universe is also expanding, then it too had an origin. So all it does is it kicks the problem upstairs. To say that, well, our universe is the product of another just kicks the problem upstairs. There are old jaded theories that some people still trot out there, but they're no good, like an oscillating model and so forth. But we won't belabor that point, probably bore you to death. We talked about all the fine details of all of these other models. If you're interested in looking at all of these different models and how I interact with them, you can check out my paper on my website, the product of my master's thesis, which has been updated in the last year, okay, to discuss current cosmology trends. But I go through painstakingly to try to show how all of these alternative models really don't solve the problem that's out there. And that's not my opinion, by the way. I'm not a cosmologist. What I do is I research heavily what physicists are saying about the models that are out there. And every one of them, except for the ambitious ones that have an agenda, every one of them acknowledge that there's a screeching halt to where the universe began. Whether it's this one or a super universe, the sentiment is the same. We don't know where it came from, and it can't be eternal. Next question. Well, isn't the universe then part of an eternal multiverse? Now, this is a little different than the super universe. We're not talking about our little bubble inside of a bigger bubble. This one is talking about that we are a bubble with a bunch of other bubbles alongside of us. And these bubbles alongside of us aren't actually in anything. So that you can have an eternal number or an infinite number of parallel worlds. Again, without getting into the gooey scientific semantics of what's called the multiverse model, and quite frankly, nobody really knows if there is a multiverse or not. There could be, again, just like a super universe, I don't know, there could be. Okay? We have to let science speak for itself, and so far, the opinion's kind of diverse. When it comes to the multiverse, though, the many worlds, I should say, and yes, a many worlds viewpoint basically says there is a world where you are actually sitting in a crowd of being taught by Harold Camping about the end of the world. And we all believe it. Or there's another world where we're all sitting on our heads and not on our rears. Okay? Or there's a world where we're in the same room but there's no chairs. And we're hanging from the rafters on shoestring. No matter, and the reason why you can say all that is because there are an infinite number of worlds, and so every possibility comes to realization. It's not a question of, is that possible? Really, it's, if that's possible, it is occurring somewhere else. There's a world where I don't exist. There's a world where you don't exist. There's a world where all of us are conjoined twins. There's a world where none of us exist. There's a world where we're not in a building, but we're in the belly of a huge beast. You use your imagination. That's kind of how these things tend to look a little exotic. But forget that for a moment. We don't want to cheap shot the multiverse hypothesis. The point is if there are many worlds in concert, there must be a world ensemble generator. Because, again, these worlds have origins. They're not just eternal. They're not just there. They come into existence. So until we learn a little bit more about these many worlds, to speculate what the signs of them would be completely to go outside of our domain of what we have a right to do. We just don't have any information about what these other worlds are. In fact, we're so worried about that one wonders if we don't just say that there are many worlds just to solve certain problems. But, well, think of it this way. Let's say you want to know why the level of entropy at the beginning of the universe is so low. Wow, it's a low-level entropy, and that's a problem. How do we have that in our universe that randomly was generated? Well, again, all possibilities can be realized in multiple worlds. We just happen to be the world that doesn't have higher entropy. Okay, that's rational. But let me put this in another context to show you why this puts such a strange question mark on this as a line of reasoning. So we're all sitting down playing let's say a game of Texas Hold'em. And every single time, I'm getting 2 aces. We keep playing this game of poker, and every time I get 2 aces, and the hand that keeps getting the community hand that keeps getting dealt has 2 aces on the table every time. So I got 2 aces. The community hand always has 2 aces, despite the dealer assuring you that they're shuffling consistently. Now, you would think there's something suspicious with the game, and that I was cheating in some way. And you would be right to do that by most lights. But suppose I said, you can't accuse me of cheating, because this just happens to be the world, amongst all of the parallel worlds that are out there, where I'm getting dealt aces every single hand. We just happen to be in that world. So there's a concern, and this is a legitimate concern. This isn't my own. This is a legitimate concern among scientists, that one wonders if we put the multiverse theory out there to try to cover our tracks for things that seem extraordinary to explain. And a lot of work is going into this as of recently, and it's very interesting to see where this is ultimately going to end up. But Robin Collins has yet to produce a paper, which is fascinating. I'll talk a little bit about this in the summertime. But he's talking about, well, I won't get into the mechanics now. The point is that this is cutting-edge stuff. Okay, this is what's being talked about right now. Is there a many worlds out there of which we are just one among many? The only promising model that's been devised right now in its entirety is one produced by Alexander Vilenkin. The problem is he uses terms that are ambiguous. And when he talks about simultaneous with, or he talks about time as though it's a dimension of space, this is something that Stephen Hawking has done a lot in his works. Treating time as another dimension of space doesn't fly when you think about reality, because to a metaphysician, time is not just like space. It is a fundamentally different apparatus. Time has something to do with duration. Space has to do with, planar relationship, the distance between 2 points, as it were. But that's not the case with time. It's a fundamentally different animal. I know it works on paper. We could talk about coordinate time and map out time on paper. But time literally is not space. That doesn't make sense. So I think that problem plagues some of what Vilenkin has to say, among other things. And until we get sort of a knockdown argument or some sort of confirmatory evidence outside of speculation that there is a many worlds ensemble in some way, it seems to me no better than the so-called God of the gaps argument that's often trotted out there. Next slide. What about the fifth premise, then, in the argument? Why does the cause have to be personal? Let's get back to the impersonal scenario. This is an old question, and I actually dealt with this in my master's thesis because it was brought up a lot by Michael Martin. He's a retired philosopher from Boston College. And in his book, it's a big, thick volume called Atheism, a Philosophical Justification. And he goes to great lengths to defend this idea that it's possible that the universe is the product of eternal matter, that there's some kind of sea of oceanic energy out there that's just always been around, and from the sea suddenly erupts the universe in some way. Now, he doesn't really describe eternal matter. He just puts it out there as a bare possibility. The problem with eternal matter is exactly what I talked about earlier. To talk about eternal matter means something that's endowed by physical laws. So what does it do? If it suddenly changes its state, it must be acted upon to do that. Because if it's doing it of its own accord, it has to have a will to do that. Okay? Matter doesn't just decide to do something different that it has done for all eternity. It's okay, now's the point at which I'm going to change my state and produce something, especially something as vast as this universe. So that requires a lot of explaining. Far from being a resolution, that kind of a question brings up more problems than we have time to address. Next slide. All right, questions about the cause. I think all of the money is on this one. So at the end of the day, many people are willing to be quite content with the cosmological argument so given that so it yields a cause for the universe. That's not surprising. The question is, how do we leap from the universe was caused to the universe was caused by God? And for the past 4 decades, this question's been dragged through the mud in an unfortunate, politically driven conversation about creationism versus evolution. In which case, it's as if to say that a cause is the same thing as talking about all the particular doctrines throughout the Old and New Testaments. That if you're going to believe in a cause, then lumped in with that, you have to believe that Noah's flood explains the geological data universally. You have to believe that the universe was created only 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. And a whole host of things have to come along with the package if you're going to believe the universe was caused. That, of course, is not the case. Those doctrines are subordinate to the question of whether God caused the universe. So here's a question, or a statement nonetheless, that could be put into a question. Causes are in time and cannot apply to something outside the universe. So maybe you've heard this. Wait a minute. Cause and effect happens where something at one moment, when it causes something else, the effect happens at the next moment. But if the universe coming into existence is the point at which time itself comes into being, then to speak of a moment before the Big Bang is very much like asking the question, what is north of the North Pole? See, once you're talking about the boundary point of that measurement, time in this case, there can be no before. And so, since there's no before, you can't have a causal relationship. Nothing can cause the universe because there is no before moment. This hugely misunderstands the nature of cause and effect. Because what it doesn't take into account is what is sometimes called simultaneous causation, too. Causation doesn't have to happen where one thing, the cause, happens, and then at another moment later on, the effect happens. But yet you can have a cause and effect relationship that are simultaneous with each other. So here's an illustration of that. And it's an old illustration. If you imagine a pillow at rest from eternity, and a bowling ball existing on that pillow at rest on the pillow from eternity. Now, the cause of the indentation of the pillow from the bowling ball is clear. The bowling ball is causing the indentation. But if both have been around from eternity, that there's no point at which one existed and the other didn't, then it doesn't make any sense to say that one came before the other. Second issue is, how do we know there's not some kind of hyper time beyond the physical world? Now, I personally don't think that that's the case. But let's entertain what some physicists think. Some do think that the only thing we have going for us in this universe is that we have a certain kind of measurement of time. But there might still be some kind of absolute time that flows even in God's world. That before, quote unquote, the universe came into existence, there was a time before time. That's possible. I think there are problems with it. But that would be one question that one could entertain. The other thing is, I'm trying to think here, in terms of, what I wanted to stress is that causation is not necessarily, it can, and it does in many physical instances for sure. All that's necessary is for there to be a productive cause of something else. Okay? Time is not a necessary attribute. When we say that something caused something else, like the bowling ball causing the pillow to have the indentation, that's called a causal priority. And it doesn't necessarily have a temporal connotation, meaning that it doesn't mean that it's one and then later on the effect happens. Next point here about the cause. This is Richard Dawkins' favorite, but it's become the favorite of many on the street as well. And that's this idea that, if you say God caused the universe, you're just basically covering your ignorance for saying God did it. In Greek tragedy, if you ever study the arts, the fine arts by the ancient Greeks and into the Middle Ages, they would often have tragic scenarios where the hero would die. Okay? But before the play ended, right at the end, descending to the stage would be the gods. And they would take whatever tragedy had happened and they just immediately fix it. And then that would be the end of the play. They call that the deus ex machina. It's this idea that the gods come down at the end of the tragedy when all hope is lost, and they just fix everything. Kind of like a Clash of the Titans kind of a thing. The gods step in, and here's your shield, here's your sword, there it's done, it's fixed. And that idea is what's behind this. Now, to appreciate this question, are we just not positing God when we have no explanation? Consider all of the things in the past that some people have attributed to God. Isaac Newton used to say, you got these really odd perturbations of certain planetary orbits. Maybe God nudges the planets a little bit every time. Well, I'll come to find out, thanks to Kepler and others, that the planetary motion is explained by other bodies acting on them. Or you might say, maybe the epilepsy this man has is the result of demonic possession. But as we explore psychopathology, come to find out that there are no demons hiding in the machine, as it were. Epilepsy is a natural neurological phenomenon that can be addressed with and held at bay with certain medication. And you don't have to even think of the exotic things. Think of the strange things. My son was looking at my wife was doing history with him the other day, and he's looking at pictures of leeches, in which, of course, once upon a time, when someone was suffering from the fever, they would attach leeches to them. Why? Because they were flushed red. And they saw that as excessive blood in their system. So they would use the leeches to suck the blood out to try to bring the red down. Well, that ended up killing people. So misdiagnoses, poor physical judgments, physics judgments. When you see lightning in the sky, it's not Thor throwing his thunderbolts. It's atmospheric physics at play. God isn't nudging the planets. He's not operating from Mount Olympus. He's not directing things, in certain patterns here on Earth and that sort of thing. So it seems like the perception is that God, the more and more we study physics and nature and biology, God is getting pushed aside. Biology is another good example, right? Up until the 19th century, many people were comfortable, thanks to James Ussher, who calculated the origin of the universe, 4004 BC, September, 7 a.m. or something like this, September 1st, 4004 BC. Thanks to people like him, it was suggested that God specially created everybody. But then when Chauncey Wright and Herbert Spencer and then Charles Darwin, who borrowed the theory and incorporated the mechanism of natural selection, came into being, it was discerned that a lot of the so-called elements of design, this just happens to work over here, and this is, having this skin color just happens to be conducive to this climate, and having these physical attributes and these features just happen to be productive for this kind of situation. You could no longer attribute that to God. It was now understood that through trial and error and a process of elimination, those attributes that could be reproduced in species to the modern era now explain why we have certain features that we do, certain biological features, even psychological features, possibly even religion, some would say. So a lot of these things have survival value, and that's why they're around. Well, that's conceived as the death knell, as Frank Zindler used to say, of Christianity. You see, after all, natural selection explains everything now, and so you don't need God to explain why you seem to be so intimately and finely designed. So the God of the Gaps charge is not without a history. The concern among some scientists is, look, if every time we study physics, we tend to find naturalistic explanations, who's to say that once you look at something like the universe, that a result of physical cause in some manifestation will not be found someday? Now, I presented it that way because it sounds very strong, but the fact of the matter is that's not an accurate tale with respect to cosmology. You see, the problem of where the universe came from was a problem that has never gone away. I understand that people have made mistakes about demon possessions. And those who know me know I've come down on the Christian church for that. Okay? Because there is no warrant in thinking that they explain certain spatio-physical poltergeists and apparitions and things like that. despite the fact that some thought that they did. Historically, some in the Christian church didn't see it that way either, like Thomas Aquinas. So it was a bad interpretation that led to thinking that demons, for example, caused certain ill behavior. In fact, historically, Christians were very quick to point out when someone would see a quote-unquote madman in the street, and someone would say, aha, a demon possession. There were many Christians who were quick to say, no, you can't say that, because of what Jesus said in Matthew 24, where he says that he points out that things like epilepsy, lunacy, and so forth are separate from real demon possessions. He makes that distinction right up front. It's only because people didn't listen or misunderstood or had their own fanciful interpretation that they went to town to think that demons explain everything. And you still see that today. You know, there are some churches out there where something bad happened to you in the middle of the night, it must have been a demon. And I don't know why. I don't know why people say that. Demons were never given that job listing when they were created. They don't do that. They don't have that capability. They don't have physical manifestation ability. The same with God. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, anywhere, how God created life. So if you assume it must have been done only 6,000 years ago, you assume God must have done it apart from evolution, or you can make all of these assumptions, but quite frankly, the Bible does not address these questions. It leaves that entirely open. And interestingly enough, it was Augustine himself, only in the 400s. When he did his commentary on Genesis, he thought that each day of Genesis represented a long period of time. And as such, during this long period of time, God would create certain little potencies in nature called rationes seminales. These little potencies, like self-generating seedlings, would suddenly over time develop into more complex life. Now, that's not truly what evolution is, but it's kind of an interesting ancient theory that looks kind of similar to where evolution has gone today. It's only some people who have made a mistake in how they think God behaves that God has been pushed aside as an explanation. It's never been part of Christianity that God has had to create in a certain way, has had to have created only 6,000 years ago. Whether these ultimately end up being true or not isn't even the point. The point is one is not committed to that interpretation because the Bible's silent about it. And things like Thor and Zeus and atmospheric physics don't apply to Christianity. Christians never thought that God caused atmospheric physics and that sort of thing. Okay. When there was lightning or storms, no one ever said, oh, God must be angry with us. No. If you read the New Testament, when storms were coming, they were well understood to be naturally occurring events that could be predicted. So, getting back then to the God of the gaps, I got a couple of things to say about this. Because, again, it's a very common question that's brought up. Are we just not plugging God to cover our ignorance for where the universe came from? Remember the argument that I just put up there at the beginning of the talk. And that is that, if everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, and we exhaust all of our options and we're led to a personal cause, and then we infer what the attributes of that cause must be, and they look very close, if not identical, to God, that's not an argument from the gaps. That's a direct inference to something. A God of the gaps would be to posit God when there absolutely is no reason to do that, to totally cover your ignorance. Kind of like if Harold Camping comes out, later today or tomorrow and says, God changed his mind, or God did something different, or God straightened me out. That's a God of the gaps. There's no other reason other than to save face for God to be brought into the picture as having changed the circumstances, having done something to explain something. It's kind of like this, in the Philippines, when you ever seen them do this mystical surgery on people where they would reach their hands into people? without breaking the skin at all, supposedly, and then they would pull out what seemed to be organs or the cancerous tumor. They would do this, and it would, onlookers would be amazed. Wow, I mean, he really sticks his arm in there and he pulls out something, and there it is. And then they would run studies on the stuff that was pulled out, and it turns out it's things like chicken livers and stuff like that. You know what their response was? That is part of the system. When we reach in and pull out the offending, cancer, then the mystical gods quickly transform it into something benign like a chicken liver. That's a god of the gaps. That's throwing in something that you have no warrant into thinking, that serves no purpose other than to save your pet theory. But as far as I can tell, that's not what the cosmological argument is doing. You have these features about the universe that seem to be at least inclining us to some degree into thinking that God caused this. This being who caused the universe shares the attributes of God himself. Now, that's either a striking coincidence or, an explanation may be forthcoming, but there's no reason not to think that God is not part of your explanatory pool. Well, is that just scientific creationism then? Are you trying to turn God into a scientific hypothesis? Not at all. Believe me, I do not fit amongst those people that find themselves to be scientific creationists. I don't think that God is a scientific hypothesis. It is a metaphysical hypothesis. So that, yes, science stops at the Big Bang, but where something came from is a metaphysical question. Whether you're talking about the universe or moral values or metaphysical truths in general or aesthetic truths, these things have origins or foundations in something or someone. And those are metaphysical questions. So we're not trying to say that God is somehow some kind of a scientific explanation. So if Dawkins and others want to say, oh, that's just the God of the gaps, that's circular reasoning. It's already assuming that God cannot be an explanatory device. But you have to show why that can't be. You have to attack one of the premises given in the argument to do that. The other thing is that the God of the gaps is kind of a trivial objection. You see, you could say that about anything. I mean, imagine, Newton fashions this beautiful theory, his Newtonian world machine, where, gravity is in operation, motion is in operation, everything can be studied, and you can discern the trajectories of anything if you know all of the specifics and measurements. There's nothing that doesn't happen in a deterministic fashion, okay, in terms of physical matter and energy. So Einstein comes along, and he disavows things like the ether, for example, because Newton's world machine was thought to work in the ether, where ether fills in all of the space between you and me. So, long story short, Einstein thought that there were good reasons to think the ether didn't exist. What if Newton turned around and said, that's just an Einstein of the gaps? I see what you're saying, and an observation even confirms it, but how do you know there's not an explanation forthcoming that Newton is sitting on somewhere? So that's just an Einstein of the gaps. There's a sense in which you can trivialize this expression and apply it to any situation. Try using that in a court of law, where all of the evidence points to you. I mean, we'll look at Casey Anthony right now, right? She's on trial for having killed her daughter. And the evidence is not looking good for her, right? There's some duct tape and DNA evidence that looks like she had a hand in at least disposing of the body and so forth. What if they find her guilty? Could her defense be, that's just a Casey Anthony of the gaps because you don't have a better explanation? You're just going to pick on me? What the evidence looks like it's you, but that's a Casey Anthony of the gaps. So I think that the charge of God of the gaps is a trivial objection that's trotted out. Again, the best way to dispel or to prove, either way, the God of the gaps charge is to either support or attack the cosmological argument. So once again, you've got to get back to the argument. Trotting that out is not an objection. Finally, could this be used against atheism? To say that the best explanation for the origin of the universe is some naturalistic one Could not the theist just say, well, that's a naturalism of the gaps, a secularism of the gaps, an atheism of the gaps? So the point is unless you attack the argument itself, the original argument, it does no good to bring that out without support. Next slide. Number 4. And 5. Okay, yeah, we'll just have them all out here. Let's see. Only material things have causal properties. I don't see any good reason to support that. It's certainly true that since we only observe material things, it's obviously common for us to see that materiality is a part of the causal process. But that doesn't mean it's an essential property. After all, my mental thoughts can cause certain things like my arm to raise up. That doesn't entail, therefore, my mind or my mental states are therefore material. 4, the universe is self-caused. That's kind of an odd view. But it has been proposed in the 80s by Barrow and Tipler. And imagine what that's saying. The universe is self-caused. This omega thing, the omega point, where the universe gets to a point where it loops back with itself and creates itself, so that the universe looks like a donut in some way. Well, that suggests that the universe exists before it exists, and I don't think that that's coherent. Finally, if God created the universe, where did God come from? If everything needs a cause, God can't be exempt from the equation. That's special pleading. Notice that the premise, though, that I was talking about is premise 1, and I just misquoted it. I didn't say, and nor do cosmological arguers say, that everything that exists has a cause. What they're saying is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Because there are some things that metaphysicians know quite well are likely eternal in some sense, or uncaused, like abstract objects, laws of logic, mathematical truths, and things of that sort. They could be logically necessary things, in which case they don't come into being. Since the argument only is about things that begin to exist, then the defender only needs to say that if the universe then began to exist, it has a cause. And there's no reason to think that that's not still warranted. But to say, where did God come from, misunderstands the argument. You see, the point ultimately of the argument is that there has to be a necessary ground of being at some point. Whether it's God or anything you might imagine, something must exist necessarily from which all contingent things come about. Because otherwise, you're going to push everything back to infinity. Such and such is caused by such and such, which itself is caused by such and such, which itself is caused by such and such. At some point, it's got to have a termination point, some eternal, infinite ground of being. In fact, as I've just noted all along, that's what atheists have been saying for years. The universe is eternal. Why? Because everyone recognizes something has to be eternal. Something has to be a logically necessary thing. So it's not special pleading to suggest that God might be that thing. It's only special pleading if you just willy-nilly say that that's the case. But again, the cosmological argument, in my opinion, is a firmly established kind of argument. So once again, your attention has to go back to the argument. What's wrong with the argument that doesn't lead to the inference God caused the universe? All right, at this point, again, like I said, we could probably keep the conversation going for another year. A lot of ink has been spilt on this, but I've just tried to highlight some of the common ones. Are there any questions about whether a comprehension or commentary or interaction associated with this particular argument? Right, and that's the thing is I mean, that's absolutely right. You have to have some conception that could be applied to your data that might seek to explain it in some way. But the point is that the objection that's raised, the God of the gaps charge, is an assumption that God can't be the right answer. And I don't see why we need to jump to that. Right. Okay. Right, and that's what again, I just was sketching the argument. I didn't want to I've actually addressed this argument at length last summer, which I think it's on our podcast somewhere. But the short skinny is on that argument, there are inferences that are led to that conclusion. Thanks, Joe. We have, first of all, the universe has a cause. Through further reasoning, it's personal. Through further reflection, can we discern anything else? Well, a cause that's outside of space and time would be spaceless and timeless. So, and then something that causes the universe has to be enormously powerful to some degree. But by analogy, that's exactly what I mean, is this deliberate formation of something else. So if you have something as magnanimous as the universe, I'm not talking about design. I'm just talking about the breadth and the size and the magnitude of the universe. Something to start from an infinitesimal point and have it blossom into a universe that spans some 14 billion light years from end to end, it's got to have some oomph behind it. Okay, right. And this is something David Hume brought up, by the way. David Hume to Paul Edwards would say things like, those attributes are consistent with other things I might imagine. Yes, but here's where Occam's razor comes into play. Occam's razor, just for those who don't know what this is it's a principle that says you shouldn't basically multiply causes beyond what is needed to explain something. So that if you hear hoofbeats arriving in the distance, we hear outside a bunch of what sounds like a horse arriving, you don't say, ooh, unicorns, because that goes above and beyond the immediate evidence that you have. It could be unicorns, but the amount of evidence you have doesn't point to that. So Occam's razor shaves off the unnecessary attributes and says, as far as we know, it's just the sound of clopping. It could be likely a horse, okay, but nothing more can be gained from that. So we do that with the universe. I haven't done anything by which there wasn't some kind of inferential connection. If the cause is outside of space and time, it's spaceless and timeless. You see, that's a direct inference. I'm not just making that up. But there's nothing here that warrants the quality of pinkness or unicornness or spaghetti monsterness or anything like that. There's nothing about my inferring of the cause that leads me to these other peculiar attributes. But it seems to me, if something is outside of space and time, to be spaceless and timeless seems like a viable attribute. It seems to be if I told you I am outside of the church, then I have the property of being externally related to the church. So that's all I'm saying about the cause. The cause is externally related to space and time. Well, I just put at the very bottom here, via in reflective inference, rather than give kind of a laundry list explanation. I have written about this in my paper, but I talk about how if the Big Bang singularity is the boundary point of space and time, as Hawking and the host of others agree, then beyond that boundary point will be non-spatial, timeless thing, whatever that would be. Now, that's a direct inference. That's not coming up with pinkness or unicornness or anything like that. See, there's no warrant for that based on the attributes which I can see. I'm open to that If it turns out that there's a quality of, as Bertrand Russell would say, teapots orbiting a certain planet, if there's attributes of being a teapot of the cause, I'm open to it. But I don't know how we would derive that from the argument. Occam's razor tells me not to go beyond what the evidence communicates. That's kind of funny because usually the charge is the other way around, that God is far too complex of a being to be postulated as a cause. Well, don't confuse Occam's razor with a principle of conservatism, meaning if you have a supernatural explanation and a natural explanation on an even keel, you shouldn't prefer the supernatural one. And I agree with that. I think that's a right principle. We shouldn't opt for supernaturalism just because it sounds good. We have to go where the explanatory scope and power lead and make inference to the best explanation. But that's not what's happening here. It's not like I have an equally competing hypothesis like a pink unicorn, because there's nothing here that infers the attributes of pinkness or being a unicorn or being of a horse-like creature. There's nothing here that infers that. It doesn't mean it can't be that. It just means Occam's razor says don't go there yet because we don't have enough data. But the data we do have says being outside of space, one would be spaceless. Being outside of time, one would be timeless. Generating a universe, it's got to have some oomph behind it. And if it's not impersonal nor abstract, it's got to be personal. So it seems to me if we're going to attack the God hypothesis, there's got to be a problem with one of the premises, rather than just wonder, well, aren't there competing hypotheses out there? Again, you can put them up there, but things like an astronaut hypothesis, they don't use this reasoning for that. They use something else. But if I were to use the von Däniken astronaut hypothesis up here, it doesn't work because that would be a legitimate question. The aliens are themselves physical things. So if ancient astronauts inseminated the planet in some way, and they are material things, well, we're talking about the very cause of materiality itself, the very cause of the universe, all space and time. So that seems to me that would be a problematic indictment against astronauts that would not attend the God hypothesis. That's all. Mark.
I have one. It's about demons not causing physical ailments. It's in Job. It speaks that Satan put physical boils on Job to test him, see if he would curse God. So, and then the Bible speaks of, I don't know what your view is, but it sounded like you were saying that it doesn't say in the Bible that
Right. Job chapters 1 and 2, of course, there's this conversation between God and Satan, right? And what Satan is said to do is to smite Job with boils or some kind of skin lesion. But if you go back to 1 Samuel, for example, just to give you a little background about that phrase, to smite, a prophet comes to David and says, and affirms that he had smote Uriah the Hittite with a sword. Now, we know the story of King David, right? I mean, he didn't smite anybody. What he did was he put causes into effect that ultimately led to the demise of Uriah. So, given the same Hebrew expression, I wonder if that's not what it means in Job, that Satan went out and physically did something to Job. It could be that Satan lured Job to an area where he contracted these skin lesions, whether it was poison ivy or something like that, or might Satan have inflicted him mentally, given that he just lost his possessions, his closest friends and family members? Stress, huge amounts of stress, can cause breaking out in hives. And again, which the language of the time would have been to attribute that to Satan's work, right? So I'm not so sure that that's a physical manipulation of natural forces that lead Job to have skin lesions. It seems to me there are at least two other interpretations that account for the Job story. Because what are demons? They're spirits. They can't interact with the physical world. Right? They're of the nature of spirit. Unless they can create out of nothing physical bodies, they don't have that ability or that power. Yes. Yeah. Right. And nobody really knows if these are arbitrarily the products of our own, as John Locke says, the fancies of a man's own brain, or it could be that we're receiving input somewhere, and that's likely. And that's how Satan works in the Old and New Testaments. He never appears contrary to popular. He doesn't manifest any. He never takes on physical form. None of the demons do. They always operate from within. They never appear. Yeah. So I don't want to impose our modern misunderstanding by so many people to say that demons actually have that causal ability. But you know what? The early church was almost unanimous in that viewpoint. And that's why Richard Dawkins is right when he says, these guys thought demons did it. That's not the case. Yeah. And that's been a big blow to the Christian worldview because a lot of people misunderstood demonology. Yeah. Right. We're going to capitalize on this on October. We love Halloween time. We like to talk about demonology just because it's the spirit of the zeitgeist of the day, the season. So we're going to actually talk about that in more detail. So one more, and then we'll wrap it up so people can be dismissed here. Okay. Does anybody else have a question, comment? Because we can just go ahead and dismiss, and people can go where they may. Just remember, we're not going to be here next Monday. Okay, Memorial Day. I know, I saw your post. Don't think I didn't see that. Lame. Yeah. You know, lame that some people haven't been coming. I won't name names, but their names often rhyme with Schlea. And anyway, yeah, so we're taking the weekend off. All right, well, you're officially dismissed. Have a good couple of weeks. We'll see you hopefully in June.